morning. Welcome back to the Mayor's Table. I'm Mayor Tommy Roberts. My guest this morning is Police Chief Steve Hebbe. Steve, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Steve, this is a Wednesday good morning. This is our first Mayor's Table segment in 2018, and we hope that everybody had a safe and calm New Year's celebration.
Yes.
But we're all back at work now, and we're ready to go forward in 2018.
Yes, sir.
And I assume you are too.
Yes, sir.
All right. Steve, I want to talk today about school security in our community in Farmington. And obviously this is a topic that I think is timely, and it's germane, resulting from a very tragic incident in Aztec, our neighboring community, on December 7th of last year. And, what a tragedy it was. We had two young people who lost their lives, lost the opportunity to grow and experience life over a period of time that would be normally expected. And the result of the act of a very sick individual.
Yes, sir.
And it's a very sad time for our communities, particularly for the community of Aztec. And before we talk about what we do in the context of school security in Farmington, I want to send out our condolences to the families of Francisco and Casey, and remember them as we go forward into this new year. We also want to honor our neighbors in Aztec, the city of Aztec, those in the school system, the administrators there, those in the police department, our peers,
Yes, sir.
Those in government as well, who had to handle this very tragic event and had to manage it in
Yes,
a
sir.
way that we can only imagine how we would handle it. But I watched those people do their jobs in that situation, and I want to commend them for the job well done, from the police chief to the mayor, to the superintendent of schools, to those representing law enforcement agencies across the board. I think it was just an outstanding job under very, very, very difficult circumstances. So with that as a preface, let's talk about school security in Farmington, New Mexico. The things that happen in Aztec would cause any reasonable person to wonder, what is security like in the schools in our community? We'll have many parents out there who are concerned about the well-being of their children. And so I would like to use this episode of the Mayor's Table to talk about what's in place out there and what we do on an active basis to provide for the safety of our children in our local schools. So I know that we have officers assigned to many of our schools. Can you talk about our school resource officer program?
Sure. We have 8 officers that are assigned. They're assigned to high schools and then the filler middle schools and elementary schools. We have one assigned up on the college campus with San Juan College. They work and coordinate with the security staff up there. That security staff is unarmed security, so we're kind of the liaison with that school resource officer back to the PD. We also now have expanded into Navajo Prep as well. So we have an SRO that functions kind of part-time down there with Navajo Prep. It's been a program in Farmington that's got a long history. So maybe 25 years roughly ago that city leaders first started committing resources into the school resource program. And then, during the 90s we had things like Columbine happen, which really transformed the way law enforcement approached active shooter threats in schools, and also the way we saw schools as really a potential target. Up till then there was almost a dare attitude coming out of LA, where we're in the schools to try and teach kids to stay off drugs, but we weren't really as up on the school threat. But following Columbine, there was a bigger commitment nationally. But Farmington was already ahead of the game at that point. So they've had school resource officer programs steady for approximately 25 years, off and on with the numbers, bigger and smaller. But right now we're a pretty robust unit. They're expanded into, like I said, into the college, but their duties have expanded as well. So we do a lot more training. with school staff. And I think you could see back in the Aztec incident that's really your first responders. So law enforcement will get there when we're called, but your first responders really are your teachers and your custodial staff and your administrative staff inside the schools. And so our SROs work closely with the school district. We train a lot in that area to try and give the folks on the ground the tools to survive whatever initial threat hits them until we can get there and then aid them in putting down the threat.
Let's talk about the training protocol in more detail. Can you describe to our viewers what that training involves?
You know, we do a variety of things. So some of it's actual active shooter training, where we walk through what would happen if the school was being attacked or had an active shooter. But we also do other trainings, like if there's threats in the area and schools go into lockdown, and how does that lockdown happen and what does that look like? And even now we're analyzing what happened over in Aztec, how that lockdown went into place and what the impact was then on responding officers. So we're learning from this most recent incident. We learn from every one that occurs across the country. But we continue to try and update our training and adjust to different threats as they present themselves. You know, sometimes the threat is different than anything we've seen. This one was really, you know, unfortunately a pretty standard one, where he made entry into the school and then had a plan to carry out. But the threats aren't always the same, and sometimes they involve multiple offenders. Sometimes there's ways that we can learn something beforehand, and with that tip we go out and we contact potential threats to the school. We do that here fairly routinely in coordination with the school district to try and assess what the danger is. So in general, we have kind of a multifaceted interaction with the school district. We work closely with them to give them the tools to initial response to kind of shut things down.
I want to drill down a little bit deeper into the security protocol and take as a hypothetical a single active shooter situation, much as was the case in the Aztec High School situation. The school resource officer, if that were to happen in Farmington, would be essentially the first line of defense, I assume.
Yes.
And so what is that individual responsible to do upon that first encounter?
You know, his first response would be to attempt to suppress the threat. It depends on the nature of what he's being confronted with. If the subject had walked up on him, you know, then he could directly engage. But if he just was somewhere in the building and heard shots or heard reports of shots, then his first steps would be to communicate that to the rest of the force and start getting other resources there. But obviously, if he's face to face with a threat, then that'll be his initial response. I think you saw in San Juan College last year. We had a trespasser with a gun, armed with a gun, who was unhappy with security. And security contacted our SRO, who immediately began coordinating to get more resources from the PD there. And then he responded to the scene if we were going to need to engage him. So it really depends on what he's faced with, but ideally that would be his response.
And so then let's assume in our hypothetical there's that initial encounter with the active shooter or somebody suspected of becoming an active shooter. Is there a method of communication between the school resource officer and the school administrators on site? Does he have the ability to communicate directly with the school administrators, who in turn would then be able to communicate to the staff that there is a threat on the facility?
He does. He carries a radio that allows him to coordinate, just like I just described for the college. Same thing's true in the schools at the high school and middle school level. He has a radio that allows him to communicate directly to school security staff. And so they can communicate back with him if they were the first ones to encounter a subject. And they do fairly routinely. So there would be the ability to allow the school to go into a lockdown, which means, you know, teachers would, like we saw in Aztec, teachers would lock their doors and ensure that their kids are out of sight as much as they can be and out of danger as much as they can. In some cases, I suppose it depends on on where the students are and what the teachers' options are. If they were out in the hallways, it's possible that they'd funnel them out of the building and try and get them out of the, out of the area, depending on what the officer was encountering. So, we train a variety of those responses because there isn't a one-size-fits-all. And if you have a one-size-fits-all, it's something that they can counter. They can train to counter what you're going to do. So we do training mostly to think on your feet. What's the threat that we're seeing? But we do have good communication between the SRO. That's actually their primary role. The SRO won't be everywhere inside every school, but the communication aspect and allowing that communication both inside the school and then with law enforcement throughout the county to respond, that's really their primary role.
Are there any training exercises that involve all of the potential players in a situation like this? For example, Farmington Police Department, Farmington Municipal School officials. So how often do we meet with them to have these training exercises, and if so, how often do those occur?
I want to say it's once a year for sure that we're walking through a drill with at least school staff. I don't think that we're involving all the students in like a fire drill type thing. I don't think that we're doing that. We do some of that up on the college as well on a monthly basis. They have some sort of active shooter training in response to threats. So it's something that we regularly engage in, but you could always do more with it.
Yeah. So many of our school facilities in Farmington are relatively old. Now that is transitioning because we've had a number of new facilities constructed, and even as we speak, Farmington High School is being constructed and nearing completion. But the older facilities were not designed, they were not built at a time when there was much of a concern about this kind of a problem. And so they were essentially wide open with very little security built into the structures themselves. Not much thought probably given to that kind of security concern. The new schools are being built with the mindset that there needs to be some element of control about who has access into the facility and what access points there are. Do you have any thoughts about how the new design to deal with security issues is impacting these kinds of situations?
I've heard discussions with my school resource officers that as they're going through the construction on Farmington High School, they're adding letter identifiers onto the buildings in a very clear, visible way. That's something that for law enforcement you don't really think of when you're an architect. You're just building buildings. But when law enforcement's responding to Aztec or to any other shooting where there's multiple buildings around that potentially could be a threat, and you're going through and clearing those, I've cleared this building, I've cleared that building. It's simpler when there's a very visible symbol that says, I've cleared building D, and everybody knows what building D is. And so I've heard that's exactly what's happening at Farmington High School right now. I think PV is going through some construction where they're putting in bullet-resistant glass, so they're kind of going back, because you're right. When they built a lot of these schools, that wasn't a threat, but the threat's changing and evolving, and I think the school district is doing the best they can to kind of evolve with that. The whole lockdown procedure is something else we'll talk about. We go into lockdown a lot. When there's threats outside the school that could potentially get into the school, you want the school going on a lockdown and restricting access and making sure we're controlling it. But when there's actually a threat inside the school, how does law enforcement get in when you go to a lockdown? That's something that we're going to work on and make sure that our officers have the tools to readily get inside when there is an active threat inside the school.
Well, we know that these kinds of tragic events are happening around the country, and they aren't infrequent.
No.
There's a number of them that have happened in the last 3 or 4 years, and we can think of them. We know the tragic results of them. I think it's not a question of whether another event of this kind will happen. It's just a matter of when. It's just the part of the culture that we live in these days. So there's no way to guarantee anyone that this isn't going to happen in our community.
No.
But in your assessment, are we prepared to deal with the consequences of a situation like this?
I think we are the best that we can be. but you can always continue training and getting sharper. So what we saw out of Aztec was a rapid response by local law enforcement. Aztec PD really got on scene very quickly. They were determined to get inside the building. As soon as they did make entry in there, the shooter, succumbed and gave up and killed himself. So that kind of thing is not the way law enforcement would have been 20, 25 years ago. We would have approached, we would have put up a containment and a perimeter, and you really saw that at Columbine. Columbine in the mid-90s was still really the way I had been trained and the way law enforcement was responding to these things. Today, it's a much more aggressive, fast-paced response. As soon as you're getting officers on scene, we're not worried as much about command and control. We're getting on scene and we are making entry to try and find the threat and eliminate the threat. And just by nature of that training, you're going to reduce casualties to the civilians because you are going to get in there and engage him. And it's forcing him to either engage with the officers or, like we saw, find a different route or try and escape and get away from it. All of those are wins. So that is the way we train here at Farmington PD. You saw out there in Aztec a real coordination among local law enforcement, all the different law enforcement agencies to include, I heard La Plata County was down during that. The FBI responded to the scene. The state police were involved in it. I mean, there was a lot of resources, multi-agency that responded. And really the coordination went pretty well, and we got set up, and we did the things that needed to happen. So I would feel, if I was an average citizen in our community and I wanted to know what our police department's doing, I would feel confident that we're doing the best that we can. Now, the mayor's right. These are difficult times culturally for us with schools. They do see these folks who want to make a name for themselves, unfortunately, see these as a potential target. But I liked the way we handled kind of the post incident with Aztec. We didn't celebrate the individual that was involved, the perpetrator in it. We kind of moved on. We celebrate the folks that were unfortunate victims in it. There wasn't a lot of glory, I think, that you can take away if you're the perpetrator in that. And that's the counter we have to get, is there isn't glory in this. This isn't something to be proud of, or you've made your mark by attacking a school. But that's going to be a longer, slower change. For now, I think law enforcement's really about as prepared as we can be, and we're watching and learning, even from this most recent incident, so that we can be better.
Steve, I think we probably will close this segment out, but I want to step back and just make one point clear in my own mind. I think it probably is a question maybe that our viewers are having. So the key personnel on the ground are the school resource officers. In Farmington, we have a school resource officer assigned to each of our 2 high schools and each of our 4 middle schools. Mm-hmm. Are they there from the opening of school each day to the close of school each day? In other words, is there a constant presence?
No. For one, they attend trainings and things like that, like we're just talking about. They also will go and do trainings together at different schools. They also could be on safety teams. The safety teams that FPD has also trains civilian agencies in kind of the same tactics. And that's really what was going on out at McGee Park the day of the Aztec shooting. We actually were training a private corporation in how to respond during an active threat. So they have other tasks rather than just a security guard that stands there at the door, which is kind of what we're talking about. That's why one of their prime roles is communication facilitator. That they've got the radio to the security force of the school, and then they've got our radio where they can coordinate law enforcement response to any threats that come up.
Yeah. Steve, I want to thank you for being my guest this morning. This is an important topic. I would just indicate to our viewers that if you have any concerns or questions about how the Farmington Police Department interacts with our schools locally, don't hesitate to contact Chief Hebbe, and I'm sure he'll be happy to meet with you and to answer your questions. We want to thank you for joining us again on the Mayor's Table. We'll look forward to seeing you again next Monday.